Mark Schoenberger for National Guitar Repair. This is the second part of a two-part series of the very beginnings of National, its prototype, and its production models. Now let's take a look at the very first production model, number 0103. Here's number 0103. Let's start with the headstock. Now you see it's got this lovely big blue decal on here, this neat royal blue with the red National that cuts through it. So it's cool to see that they're sticking with the big decals. Here on 103, basically their first production guitar, they did the royal blue one. Let's take a closer look at the neck, because it tells an interesting story. Back here, you see the serial number, 0103. You also see here is this little V, and that V is part of a lamination on the back of the headstock. Now, if we remember that the Dopier brothers started out as banjo makers, this is something that they would have been used to doing on a headstock. So here we've tied all this into their banjo heritage. You'll also notice it has a very slim, tapered neck, which would have been more in the keeping of a banjo. Well, let's start with the fingerboard here. It's made out of this stunning, absolutely stunning, I cannot enforce that enough, piece of natural, unstained ebony that's got this ribbon through it. And subsequent models would use rosewood, so it's unusual to see them using ebony. The other unusual thing was that they had the fancy position markers too. Let's look at these frets. Again, we've got these banjo frets that directly bring this all back to the very beginning of National, and that's so charming. One of the other interesting things about these inlays is that you look at them and you go, well, that's not quite mother of pearl and that's not quite abalone. What is that? Now, I was speaking with Don Young over at National, and he was telling me that John Dopier mentioned that these inlays were made from freshwater mussels from the East Coast. And that made a lot of sense because there was a button industry that used a lot of that material. In fact, they used so much of it that they kind of wiped out the freshwater mussel. The first thing you're going to notice is that this has an overall cleaner look. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that for the first time, they used nickel plating over this nickel silver body. So that sort of cleans it up and gives it that shiny kind of thing going on. And the other thing too is that you'll notice here that these diamonds are all stamped. And the cover plate is actually sitting in a little stamped lip now. And that's very significant. That means that very early on, they started stamping parts of the body. Now, the other parts that they didn't stamp and that remained hand-cut for the rest of their tenure at National were the diamond holes. And these are really charming because you can tell they're sort of hand-cut. They have a little swoop to them. And that even gives it more movement sort of running around here. The other cool thing here is that these holes were stamped, but they had to be finished off by hand, and Rudy would have been, doing it with a hammer, and you can really feel the hammer marks on this. It's really charming. And the other unmistakable thing here is that it's got screens behind it. And they were really thinking ahead, because this was the first round neck that they did. And they didn't want you to be able to see inside. It was all part of this mysterious little thing they had going on. It's like, how does this thing work? Two things we're looking at here now. One is that they've tapered this body because they wanted a little bit of angle. So they knew about that. They knew how banjos worked and how to make everything function. So it was nice to see that they really had planned ahead for this. And the other thing is that there's no more unsightly solder joints because they finally went to the plating, which they hoped they didn't have to do, but certainly made a world of difference. And you'll see there's no longer an unsightly solder joint here. It's all covered up by the plating. Everything looks slick and neat and tight. The other thing that you'll notice here is that the grills are no longer woven. And there's one more little feature here that I really love, is that they textured these grills with a little fine blast of sand blasting here that gave it a texture and it made it glint from other things. And the other interesting thing too is that these grills here were probably from the same batch that they made 102 from, because they mic out to be perfectly the same. And here's a neat shot of the two cover plates together. I mean, it's a big jump from here to there, going from the curves here to the more modern look over here. The hand-cut diamonds, the stamped diamonds. No screens, screens. Here you can see they spot soldered the screens on. And here's another advancement here. And this was likely another contribution from Adolf Rickenbacker, because he was the metal worker and knew how to make boxes and all sorts of things out of metal. So I'm sure he said, look, don't bend things around. That's going to cost you money. Just put these L brackets on here and it'll stiffen up and you'll be fine. You can see where this is a lovely stamped piece of metal here. And it's way, way worlds apart from that hand-cut deal. And I can see where they would definitely want this stamped out, because you do not want to cut these diamonds every time. Here you see a fully stamped hand rest. It's no longer cut and just folded. This is a deep draw stamp, and that's another thing that really cleaned things up. The other interesting feature is that this still retains this large flange that covers up the original line of this design underneath. You can see that they've dropped the swoop here and dropped the swoop there. And that's likely from Adolf Rickenbacker pointing out that, it's going to be cheaper to make a square cut here, and also you'll find that it really fits in better with the overall design of Deco, rather than having these weird swoops here. It's got this direct streamline thing going on. The other thing too is that they used to be able to see the cut underneath here, that, remember from 102, that they'd been up to stiffen up. And now it's just clean lines underneath. And here's my favorite part, the reveal. One thing that's obvious here is now that the cover plate has an indentation to sit in. And this was stamped too. This wasn't something that they could hand hammer out. And also, the depth of the pan, you'll see, is much deeper. And the piece of wood, as we'll find, is a thinner piece of wood too, so everything just sits down a lot more. Let's take a closer look at the pan. Remove the T-bridge here. Now, you'll notice it doesn't have any screws. It's not held down by anything that you can see. And I think the Doppera brothers are being rather mischievous this day. It's like, let's hide everything. Let's, put these screens to obscure the view on the inside. Let's put screens just to make this sort of this mysterious, what's going on kind of thing. But what's really clever is that here we see they moved the screw underneath the cone just to hide it. If we turn it over, you'll see this little detail right here, and this tells a lot. They had originally drilled through and were going to put a center screw from here to there and into the stick. And what they did was they decided, we'll just hide everything. So they filled this hole and they painted over everything and moved the screw over here. I think that's so cool. One of the things that warms the cockles of my heart are these pencil lines. Simple little pencil lines. But they were done by John Doppera. Another feature of this pan is this slot right here that let this sit down flush over the neck stick that runs through the body. You can also see these little nicks here at the corner, and that was to avoid the screws that were holding the neck stick to the pan. All the hand rabbiting so it would sit flush down the pan. The spreading of the extra paint here is just charming. It's like, this isn't going to be seen. We can get away with that. Once again, you can see where they've soldered in this big piece of metal here, and they've crimped up the edge for the pan to sit on. And this wouldn't change until much later when they'd had the metal pan stamped out. Sometimes you'd have problems where this would sort of pinch in and it would cause problems with the cones. So they weren't always as careful as they should have been. Another thing, too, is that these didn't always quite fit, so sometimes the cone would be sitting just slightly off the side a little bit, and that must have caused a lot of headaches for them. You'll also see here these wonderful handmade post and pads. Again, made out of nickel silver with a nickel silver collar and a place for the post. Just charming. There's so much amazing stuff to look at, and I was so blown away by all of it. But there was one thing inside that just totally took me for a loop here. I was just totally blown away. And it's a secret that the Doppera brothers have kept from the world in general for some 80 years or so. And I'd like to think it was something special between the three brothers. So let's take a look at this little special secret that they've been holding back all these years. It was hidden underneath this post and pad right here. And I'll remove this other post and pad in the neck and we'll take a better look at it. What we see here is this wonderful 3, not cut just once, but twice, and this incredible flourish afterwards. They knew this was something special. This was their 3rd time as the charm. This was number 103. This was their bright and shining future. And this is so personal, words just escape me. This is really this neat little secret that they held together until the day they died. And this is the first reveal of this, and I'm really happy to share this with you. And I hope you get the sense of the pride and the sense of the future that they were making for themselves, these immigrants from the old world to the new world. It's just beautiful. Let's start with the bridge. Now, this was a big surprise for me because I expected the skeletal bridge, and I got a bridge from, just before 1928. What this tells us is that the skinny skeletal bridge was sort of a defective item here. Otherwise, they wouldn't have replaced it. They wouldn't have changed so radically to what they were doing here. And here you can see they've hollowed out the casting and made this unit a lot lighter. The first piece we saw in 102 was just a solid chunk. It was beautifully cast, but it had some heft to it. Here you can see where they drilled out for the bevel for the cone, and these have the screws in it here. Later on, they changed to the same casting virtually, but they'd cast the little nubs there that would be cut when they were drilling this bit here. This has a typical piece of rosewood is what they used for a lot of the early saddles. And this was crimped in a vise, made smaller, and then fit in here and expanded. So it was really, truly a very good and clever press fit. And you can actually see the jaw marks along here on the wood. It's kind of a neat little detail. Here's the next generation of cones here. These are about 1/8 of an inch taller. And as they spun it down to here, and this lip is all pressed into it. And they had, a female and male mold, and stamped it. And it caused the nice sharp edges here, and it also shows this crimping here, which shows that it's a stamped cone. One of the more interesting features about this cone, and it's something that most people don't know about, is this dimple right here. It shows up on all the early non-spiral cones from this point on. And it's almost an identifier that you can tell that this is an early original spiral cone. Now this dimple came in from the stamping process when they stamped the edge on here. And I rather imagine it was a wooden stamp, because these were spun on a wooden mandrel. And I think a little piece of the wood sort of started popping out and ended up causing this dimple when it was stamped. And later on in 1928, they added the spirals to the cone, because these cones they're only 6/1000ths thick, and they're sort of fragile, but they're not, because the cone shape lends it a lot of strength. But nonetheless, these were thin cones, and when they put the spirals in here, it really made sure that they didn't get any of these things back. Another indicator that this is like basically the first run of these cones is that you don't see any sandpaper marks on here. Now, as these non-spiral cones progressed, they would start sanding the backs of the aluminum because it started to spin on the wooden mandrel. And you can see here it was a fresh mandrel. They had no problems. When I first got these cones, these were all crushed, and so I reformed the cone by hand, slowly, patiently, getting the wrinkles out. And as you can see, the metal really wants to go back to where it wants to be originally. I wouldn't try this at home. It's very difficult, and these are priceless cones. It's fun having these two bodies together because you really get the sense of the old world flowing into the new world. And this one retains some of the old world with their hand-cut diamonds, hand-hammered bits here. And this charming folk piece is really inspirational to see the jump from here to here. And it's so American, These guys just were in there to get this thing done. They had the prototypes. They decided what they were going to do. They decided upon design features, the height of everything. And they really made a commitment. And you can see here the definite influence that Adolf Rickenbacker had. He cleaned up these lines, going from here and here, and made it just that much more perfect. I mean, this is really perfect, but this is taking it up that next level, making this the American-made guitar. One of the things that I'm taking away from this whole project is the sense of America, the sense of brotherly love that came through in studying the workings of the early Nationals and how they got things done, and finding out little things like that they called Rudy the mechanic because he was a problem solver. So you basically had John Dopera, the dreamer, and Rudy, the mechanic, and they'd hand off things to one another. I bet you they probably finished each other's sentences. At least I'd like to think so. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this series, and we'll see you again soon. I'm Mark Schoenberger for National Guitar Repair.